September 19th, 1941. 0147 hours. 20 miles east of Norwich, 22,000 feet. Oberleutnant Fritz Weidel commanded a Heinkelhe 111 returning from a bombing raid on London. The mission had been textbook. His navigator had found the target using radio beams. The bombardier had released ordnance over what appeared to be industrial areas, and the bomber was now heading home across the North Sea. Weidel was confident. British fighters didn't operate effectively at night. The RAF's day fighters were formidable. But once darkness fell, German bombers owned the sky. Below them was nothing but darkness. Britain's blackout was total. No city lights, no vehicle headlamps, nothing that would help British defences locate German aircraft. Weidel's crew had been briefed that British night fighters occasionally made lucky intercepts, but the odds were overwhelmingly in the bombers' favour. The sky was enormous, the night was dark, and British fighters had no way to find individual bombers among the thousands of cubic miles of empty air. Then the cockpit lights flickered strangely, dimming for a moment before returning to normal. Weidel's radio operator mentioned odd interference on his equipment, brief static that didn't correspond to British radio transmissions or German navigation beams. Weidel dismissed it as atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction. The Heinkel droned steadily toward the coast, maintaining altitude and course, the crew beginning to relax as they approached what they considered safe airspace. The cannon fire came without warning. 20mm shells tore through the Heinkel's port wing, punching holes in the fuel tank and shredding control surfaces. The impact felt like someone had struck the aircraft with a massive hammer. Weidel instinctively threw the bomber into a diving turn, but more shells arrived, walking up the fuselage toward the cockpit. The rear gunner screamed something unintelligible before his gun fell silent. Either he was dead or his position was destroyed. Weidel never saw the attacking fighter. He looked desperately in all directions, but saw only darkness. No navigation lights, no exhaust glow, nothing that would reveal where the attacker was positioned. Yet the cannon fire kept coming, precise and deadly, striking the bomber from what seemed like point-blank range, but from a direction Weidel couldn't determine. The Heinkel's port engine caught fire. Weidel had seconds to decide: stay with the burning aircraft and hope to reach German-held territory, or order bailout over Britain and accept capture. The fire spread rapidly, and the decision was made for him when the wing structure began to fail. "Raus! Raus!" he screamed, ordering the crew to abandon aircraft. Weidel parachuted into darkness, watching his bomber spiral downward, trailing flames. As he descended, he saw something that made no sense. A shadow passed between him and the burning Heinkel, a dark shape that was clearly an aircraft but showed no lights and made no sound he could hear over the wind. The British fighter had circled back, apparently watching the bomber fall, ensuring the kill before departing into the darkness from which it had emerged. Weidel survived, was captured by Home Guard units, and spent the remainder of the war in POW camps. He never understood how the British fighter had found him. There had been no searchlights, no flak to illuminate his bomber, no visible reference points that would allow a fighter to locate a single aircraft in thousands of cubic miles of dark sky. The British had somehow seen his bomber when vision should have been impossible, tracked it precisely enough to guide a fighter to interception range, and killed it with fire that suggested the attacker had been absurdly close, perhaps 50 meters, when it opened fire. Years later, after the war, Weidel learned about radar and understood what the cockpit light flicker had meant. The British hadn't seen his bomber visually. They'd been tracking it electronically, with systems Vidal's intelligence briefings had never mentioned, and technology German forces had underestimated catastrophically. The darkness that was supposed to protect German bombers had become a weapon Britain turned against them, transforming night from sanctuary into hunting ground where British fighters operated with advantage German crews never comprehended until they were already dying. The night bombing problem. Britain's vulnerability to night bombing in 1940 and early 1941 represented strategic crisis that threatened to make cities uninhabitable and industrial production impossible. German doctrine had evolved to emphasize night attacks after the Luftwaffe discovered that daylight bombing operations suffered unsustainable losses to British fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Night bombing reduced accuracy substantially. Bombardiers couldn't see targets clearly, navigation was difficult, and bombing results were poor compared to daylight operations. But the survival rate was dramatically higher. British fighters rarely intercepted night raids successfully. Anti-aircraft fire was largely ineffective when gunners couldn't see targets, and German bombers could operate over Britain with casualty rates low enough to sustain indefinitely. The strategic implications were severe. German bombers flying at night could attack British cities, industrial facilities, and ports with relative impunity. The psychological impact on civilian populations was substantial. The sound of air raid sirens, the knowledge that bombers were overhead but invisible, the random nature of where bombs would fall. Industrial production suffered as workers spent nights in shelters rather than in factories. Port operations were disrupted when facilities were bombed and fires consumed warehouses and ships. The accumulated damage threatened to degrade Britain's ability to continue the war through attrition rather than decisive victory. British air defense in 1940 relied primarily on visual detection and interception. Searchlight batteries would attempt to illuminate bombers, allowing anti-aircraft guns to engage them or enabling fighters to locate and attack. But searchlights rarely found bombers in the enormous volume of dark sky, and when they did, bombers could often evade the beam faster than guns or fighters could respond. Fighter patrols operating at night had minimal success. Pilots couldn't see bombers until they were extremely close, at which point interception was difficult and dangerous. The casualty rate among night-flying fighters was unacceptably high, given how rarely they achieved kills. The radar foundation. Britain's development of radar provided the detection capability that made night interception possible, but the technology's limitations meant that radar alone wasn't sufficient for effective defense. The chain-home radar network, operational from 1939, could detect incoming bomber formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The installations used enormous antenna arrays, towers 300 feet tall, supporting horizontal wire grids that transmitted and received radio pulses. When those pulses reflected from aircraft, the radar operators could determine approximate range, bearing, and altitude. This provided strategic warning that bombers were approaching and gave fighter command time to scramble interceptors and position them roughly where they'd be needed. But chain-home had significant limitations. The radar provided approximate positions rather than precise tracking. Bearing accuracy was several degrees. Altitude estimates could be off by thousands of feet. The radar couldn't track aircraft over land effectively, losing targets once they crossed the coast. Individual aircraft couldn't be distinguished within formations. The system was designed for early warning and initial interception setup, not for the precise tracking required to guide fighters directly to bombers. Chain-home low supplemented the high-altitude coverage with lower-frequency radar that could detect aircraft flying below chain-home's coverage. This closed a gap that German bombers had exploited. approaching at very low altitude to avoid detection before climbing to bombing altitude over British territory. But Chain-Home Low had even less precision than its high-altitude counterpart. It could detect that aircraft were present, but provided minimal information about their exact positions. The radar network provided foundation for defense, but needed additional systems to make night interception practical. Ground controllers could vector fighters to general areas where bombers were operating, but closing to firing range required better tracking than ground radar could provide. Fighters needed their own detection capability, some way to find bombers in the final miles of approach when ground radar was too imprecise and visual acquisition remained impossible in darkness. Ground control innovation. Britain developed ground-controlled interception procedures that transformed radar detection into effective fighter direction, creating human-operated system that could guide fighters to within interception range despite technology limitations. Filter rooms at sector stations received raw radar data from multiple chain-home installations. Operators plotted aircraft positions on large map tables, updating tracks as new data arrived. The plotting process converted electronic signals into visual representation that controllers could interpret. Formations appeared as moving markers on the map, showing heading, approximate altitude, and estimated strength. Controllers communicated with fighter pilots by radio, providing continuous updates on bomber positions and directing course changes to set up interceptions. The process was fundamentally collaborative. Controllers couldn't see what pilots saw. Pilots couldn't see the broader tactical picture controllers had access to. Success required trust on both sides. With pilots following vectors they couldn't verify independently, and controllers making decisions based on imperfect data about both friendly and hostile aircraft positions. The procedures evolved through experience. Early attempts at ground control were crude, with controllers providing general directions that rarely resulted in successful intercepts. Pilots had to search large volumes of sky based on imprecise vectors, burning fuel while trying to spot bombers visually in darkness. But as controllers gained experience and procedures were refined, success rates improved. Controllers learned to predict bomber courses, to position fighters for optimal intercept geometry, to account for altitude differences and closing speeds. The radio communications were terse and professional. A typical exchange: hostile bearing 270, Angels 20, range 15 miles, turn port heading 250, climb to Angels 22. The pilot would acknowledge and execute, trusting that the controller's information was accurate despite having no independent confirmation until visual or electronic contact was established. The system worked because controllers became skilled at interpreting radar data, and pilots became confident in following vectors even when they seemed to lead nowhere initially. But ground control could only position fighters in approximate vicinity of bombers, typically within several miles. Closing from several miles to firing range in darkness remained a problem that ground control alone couldn't solve. Fighters needed autonomous capability to detect bombers at ranges where visual acquisition was still impossible, but where the target was close enough that interception was practical. Airborne interception radar. The development of aircraft-mounted radar provided the final capability required for effective night interception, giving fighters ability to detect bombers at ranges sufficient for controlled approach and attack. The AI Mark IV radar, operational from late 1940, represented extraordinary miniaturization achievement. Radar sets that required rooms full of equipment on the ground were reduced to systems small enough to fit in fighter aircraft, though small was relative. The installation required substantial modifications to aircraft, with aerials mounted on wings or nose and operator equipment filling what would normally be navigation or bomb aimer positions. The system worked by transmitting radio pulses forward and detecting reflections from aircraft in the beam path. The radar operator watched a cathode ray tube display showing electronic returns as bright spots or lines. Range was indicated by horizontal position, relative bearing by vertical deflection. An experienced operator could interpret the display to determine bomber position with accuracy of several hundred meters, far more precise than ground radar, but still requiring skill to translate electronic signals into actionable information. The effective range was approximately 4 to 5 miles under favorable conditions, less in poor weather or if the bomber was flying at very low altitude where ground returns cluttered the display. This meant that ground control still needed to position the fighter within several miles of the bomber before AI radar became useful. But once AI contact was established, the fighter crew could conduct interception independently, following electronic guidance rather than relying on visual acquisition. The typical engagement sequence began with ground control vectoring the fighter to within AI range. The radar operator would scan his display, calling out when he detected a contact. Contact, 3 miles, slightly right. The pilot would adjust course to center the contact, reducing range while maintaining position behind and slightly below the bomber to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. At approximately 300 meters, close enough that visual acquisition became possible even in darkness, the pilot would attempt to sight the bomber visually, confirm identification, and open fire. The Germans never fully understood this capability. Intelligence reports mentioned that British fighters seemed able to find bombers in darkness, but German analysis attributed this to lucky encounters or unknown visual techniques. The concept of aircraft-mounted radar was considered theoretically possible, but impractical. German engineers assumed the equipment would be too bulky, too unreliable, and too difficult to operate for combat use. Even when German forces captured British aircraft with AI radar intact, the significance wasn't immediately recognized. The night fighter aircraft. Britain adapted and developed specific aircraft for night interception, creating platforms that combined radar carrying capacity, heavy armament, and handling characteristics suited to the specialized mission. The Bristol Beaufighter entered service in late 1940, providing the RAF with purpose-designed night fighter for the first time. The aircraft was large by fighter standards, crew of 2, twin engines, substantial ammunition capacity, but it offered advantages that made it ideal for night operations. The size allowed installation of AI radar without compromising other systems. The twin engines provided redundancy and sufficient power to maintain speed while carrying radar equipment and heavy armament. The stability was superior to single-engine fighters, making it easier to fly on instruments in darkness while the radar operator concentrated on his display. The armament was devastating. 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns, all mounted in the nose firing forward, provided firepower that could destroy bombers with brief engagement. The cannon were particularly effective. High explosive shells would shatter aircraft structures, penetrate fuel tanks, and disable engines with hits that rifle-caliber weapons wouldn't achieve. A 2-second burst would typically be sufficient to kill a bomber, assuming the shells struck vulnerable areas. The de Havilland Mosquito complemented the Beaufighter from 1942 onward, offering superior performance in a somewhat smaller airframe. The wooden construction was lighter than metal, allowing higher speeds while carrying comparable radar and weapons. Mosquito night fighters could catch German bombers that would outrun Beaufighters, and the higher speed made them less vulnerable to return fire during attacks. The wooden airframe also had unexpected advantage. It reflected radar poorly, making mosquitoes difficult for German radar to detect even after Germany deployed its own airborne radar systems. The crews were specialists, pilots trained extensively for instrument flying, learning to maintain controlled flight in complete darkness while performing combat maneuvers. Radar operators developed skills interpreting electronic displays, distinguishing real contacts from clutter, maintaining track through evasive maneuvers. The teamwork was essential. Successful interception required pilot and radar operator working together seamlessly, each trusting the other's skills, communicating continuously despite the stress of operating at night while hunting enemies they couldn't see. The final assessment, Fritz Weidel spent years in POW camps before returning to Germany after the war. He learned about radar eventually, understanding how British forces had detected his bomber, tracked it across British airspace, vectored a fighter to intercept range, and guided that fighter to killing position despite total darkness. The explanation answered the question he'd asked since September 1941, how did they find us? But didn't reduce the fear he remembered from that night when cannon fire tore his bomber apart without warning. Without any indication, British defences had detected them until they were already dying. The British night defence system represented integration of technologies and procedures into organisation that was greater than some of its components. Ground radar provided detection, filter rooms translated data into actionable intelligence, controllers vectored fighters to intercept positions, AI radar enabled final approach, and trained crews executed kills. Each element was necessary but insufficient alone. Remove any component, and the system's effectiveness degraded catastrophically. The Germans never fully understood this system during the period when it mattered strategically. By the time German intelligence had assembled a complete picture of British capabilities, the Blitz was over, German night bombing had failed, and Britain had survived the attempt to destroy its cities through aerial bombardment. The darkness that was supposed to protect German bombers had become weapon Britain turned against them through technology and procedures German forces hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter effectively when they finally recognized the threat. The lesson extended beyond tactical success. Wars could be won through defensive systems that didn't require defeating enemy forces in decisive battles. Merely making enemy operations unsustainably costly would force operational changes that achieved strategic objectives. British night defenses didn't destroy the Luftwaffe's bomber force entirely. They made night bombing over Britain so dangerous that Germany chose to stop rather than accept continued losses. That choice, forced by a defensive system that cost less than the offensive campaign it defeated, represented strategic victory achieved through technology and organization rather than superior firepower or tactical brilliance. German bomber crews who survived the war remembered the terror of operating over Britain during the period when British night fighters were achieving systematic success. The operations that had seemed relatively safe in early 1941 became suicide missions by late 1941 as British capabilities matured. The crews never saw the fighters that killed them, never knew they were being tracked until cannon shells arrived, never understood how British forces found individual bombers in thousands of cubic miles of dark sky. The darkness that was supposed to be sanctuary became hunting ground where invisible predators operated with technology that seemed like magic to crews who died without comprehending how they'd been detected. Britain had turned night from German advantage into British weapon, transforming defensive challenge into offensive capability through integration of radar, ground control, airborne detection, and specialized aircraft into system that hunted bombers systematically. The Germans never fully understood how it worked while it mattered strategically, and by the time they developed comparable capabilities, the period when night bombing could have altered the war's outcome had passed. Britain survived because its scientists, engineers, controllers, and aircrew created and operated defensive system that defeated German bombing campaign through making it too costly to sustain. That success, achieved in darkness against enemies who never saw what killed them, was as decisive as any victory in daylight combat.